Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Lexington County Public Library System's Adult Summer Reading Program. I'm excited tonight to have Lieutenant Colonel John Miles with us to give us a talk about the Vikings in Ireland. I wanted to do a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. So I've turned everybody's cameras and microphones off. As we go through the session, through the presentation tonight, if you've got a question that you'd like to pose to John, if you type it into the chat, I will pass it along to him. Yeah, so we're going to have plenty of opportunities as the program goes for you to ask a question of John. Thank you for being here. The attendees, I want to thank John for being here. This is our fourth adult summer reading presenter so far, is in June. How you looking over there, John? You see us? We look good?
I'm good.
Okay, awesome. And I've got a presentation, a PowerPoint that we're going to work through. Hopefully everybody can see that, but you should see a Viking longboat on there. It should say you should see Vikings in Ireland on the page. Yeah, so if anybody's got any questions, again, type them into chat and I'll pass them on to John. A little bit of an introduction is probably needed for John. So John Miles is a retired United States Marine Corps Lieutenant Colonel and former college professor who now writes and delivers lectures about historical topics to groups. He's presented lectures to multiple Scottish Highland Games, Celtic festivals, and military units throughout the Southeast. In addition to Highland Games and military organizations, he also gives historical presentations at various retirement homes and libraries in the Carolinas. In addition to his novel Magnus's Saga Beyond Vinland, John is a multiple-time published author in the Marine Corps Gazette, the professional journal of the Marine Corps. Furthermore, he also writes articles for periodicals that cover history and has been published numerous times. These magazines include American Frontiersman, The Highlander, Military History, Ireland's Own, Scottish Magazine. He received his Master's of Arts degree in Military Studies from American Military University and his Bachelor of Arts degree in Anthropology with a minor in History from Texas A&M University. Yeah, there you go. I won't hold that against you being a Carolina fan, but anyways, yeah, so I'm going to turn it over to you, John. I've got the presentation pulled up, and you want me to go ahead and click to the first slide?
Please do.
Okay.
All right. Now, 1,000 years ago in Ireland, it is no wonder that Celtic monks regularly prayed, "From the fury of the Northmen, O Lord, deliver us." That was actually in the litany of the Catholic Church in Ireland back then. Now, the Vikings were first recorded in Ireland in around 795 AD when they sacked Lambay Island off the coast of Dublin, and that's pictured on the right of the screen. Now, sporadic raids from Scandinavia then continued over the following years, which in turn led to a more permanent Viking presence. Beginning in the 700s, seafarers from what came to be the countries of Norway, Sweden, and Denmark started venturing further offshore to explore and raid. Those countries at that time did not exist. There were a bunch of independent kingdoms that eventually coalesced into those countries, but back then they were not. Now, the word Viking originally meant a man from the Vik, which is the large bay lying between Norway and Sweden. Next. All right, circled in red is the Vik Bay. So that's all a Viking was a man who came from that area. That was it. All right, next slide. So the question is, why did the Vikings go all the way from Scandinavia to the British Isles? Various forces launched the Vikings on the raids and voyages. One big factor was the European power vacuum caused by the decline of the Frankish Empire. A quick history refresher. The Roman Empire was the main preeminent power in Europe after the turn of the millennium, from BC to AD. They collapsed in 476 AD, and Rome actually left Britain in 410 AD. They were gone. It was still Roman Britain, but the legions were gone. They were replaced first by the Merovingian dynasty and then Charlemagne's Frankish Empire, which in turn was gone by 843 AD. Now, the Vikings raided France at the end of Charlemagne's life. He died in 814. He said, quote, "I do not fear these bandits to do me any harm. I am sick at heart to think that even in my lifetime, they dared to attack this coast. And I am horror-stricken when I think of the harm they will do to my descendants and their subjects," end quote. If there has ever been a more prophetic statement, I've never read it. But that's exactly what Charlemagne said. Now, this power vacuum invited raids. And sure enough, just like Charlemagne was worried about, the Vikings even besieged Paris in 845 and only left after the French gave them 5,670 pounds of gold and silver. That weighs as much as a full-size SUV of gold and silver. That's how much they paid them. That would be worth at least $50 million in today's money, at least. Now, as raiding parties increase in size, the Vikings go bolder and strike further inland by sailing up rivers. I'll talk about that here in a minute. Now, as repeated successes further increase the size of the raiding parties, the Vikings would establish winter bases rather than return home to Scandinavia for the winter. Okay, the reason I have that word winter in quotes and italics, like Matt said, I'm a retired Marine. Under NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the Marine Corps is responsible for defending Norway from the Russians. So if the Russians attack Norway, the Marine Corps has to go over and help defend it. And because the Russians may attack in the winter, we have to go over there to Norway in the winter to train. So yeah, I got to live outdoors in Norway in the winter. After that experience, I fully understood how come the Vikings want to be anywhere but there in the wintertime. All right, now these encampments would eventually become colonies. Next slide, please. All right. In the 830s, the Vikings began to build what were fortified naval encampments known as long forts throughout the coastal areas of Ireland. In the mid-9th century, Viking leader Thorgest found a stronghold at Dublin, ransacked Leinster and Meath, and raided other parts of Ireland. Now, the Norse went on to establish independent kingdoms in Dublin, Waterford, Wexford, Cork, and Limerick. The reason that I've got Waterford and Wexford in italics, any word in Ireland that ends in ford, any town name, comes from a Viking fjord. In Old Norse, fjord was a bay on the ocean that was fed by a river. That was a fjord. And if you look at a map of Waterford and Wexford, Ireland, they sit on bays and they're fed by rivers. So every town name ending in ford is Viking fjord. All right. Now, the Viking invasion and colonization of Ireland was frequently contested by native Irish kings. They didn't like it, of course. But just like in Scandinavia, Ireland was not a unified country at this time. There were a whole bunch of independent kingdoms. Now, eventually there would be a high king who kind of controlled them all, but it was a long time to get to that. Now, Malachi Macaroni was a high king of Ireland who led the capture of Dublin in 849, in which the aforementioned Viking Thorgest was killed. Next slide, please. Now, Dublin's liberation from the Vikings was short-lived, however. In 853, a Viking warlord called Olaf the White, pictured there on the left, arrived and made himself king of Dublin. He ruled Dublin along with his brothers, which included Ivor the Boneless. Any of you who are a fan of the Viking show on TV, there really was a real Ivor the Boneless. Now, for the next 15 years, they used Dublin as their base for a series of operations against Irish kingdoms. Now, during these conflicts, the Vikings briefly allied themselves with various Irish kings when it was in the best interest of both. So it wasn't all the time the Vikings versus the Irish. There's a whole lot of interaction between the Vikings and the Irish that was not acrimonious. Now, the Dublin Vikings also carried out several raids on Anglo-Saxon England at this time. Now, the deaths of Ivar and Olaf in the mid-870s were followed by internecine conflict amongst the Vikings. These civil conflicts weakened the Viking colonies and made it easier for the Irish to unite against them. And in 902, the Irish kings of Leinster and Braga allied with each other and launched a two-pronged attack on Dublin that again drove the Vikings from the city. But just as before, this reprieve was temporary, and the Viking menace would return. Next slide, please. Now, when the Vikings were ensconced in Ireland, they used their coastal or long forts to launch raids on other parts of Ireland not under their domination. One of the preferred targets was Christian monasteries. Now, ever since the days of St. Patrick, Columba, and Bridget, Ireland had been a Christian land. However, in the 800s, most Vikings were still pagan. They still worshipped Odin, Thor, and the almost dozen other Norse gods and goddesses. To Christian, monasteries were holy ground and sacred. To the Norsemen, there was convenient targets contained of precious metals and other valuables. The reason for this, all right, back in this time in European history, there were no banks. Banks didn't exist. Like what we think of as a bank didn't exist. Those did not start to come about until the end of the medieval period, a couple hundred years after the Viking Age. Before that, during the Viking Age, if you had wealth, you had two choices. You either try to hide it in your mattress and hope nobody broke into your house and murdered your family and took it, or you give it to a monastery to watch. And because a monastery is a Christian ground, a holy ground, no local robbers are going to try to break into them because they knew what happened if they did. People would know who they were, and they'd be put to death. So these people would give the monasteries their gold and silver for a tithe. So basically they'd say, hey, if you'll watch our gold and silver, we'll give you 10% of it. And the church was like, absolutely, we'll do that. So the monasteries had all kinds of people's gold and silver. And so the Vikings loved to attack. Next slide, please. Now, besides the wealth stored in monasteries, the other item the Vikings sought were people. It is estimated that nearly 20% of the population of Viking Age Scandinavia were slaves, or in Old Norse, thralls. That was a word for slaves, thralls. To be enthralled, that's where that word comes from in English language, was to be under somebody's power as a slave. In modern English, to find something enthralling is a good thing. 1,000 years ago, not so much, wasn't good at all. Now, the largest slave market in Ireland during the Viking period was Dublin. Now, when the Vikings raided a village, they rounded up all the able-bodied villagers to be sold to slavery. That's what they did. Now, Viking longships' shallow drafts meant they could row or sail extremely far up rivers and raid villages many, many miles from the coast. And once again, that's kind of the Vikings would establish long forts in fjords because there was a river going up there, feeding the fjord. And so they would sail up that river or row up that river to raid villages. Now, since young people could serve as slaves for the rest of their lives, they're the most sought after. A lot of times the Vikings raid a village, they would kill the elderly people because they were useless to them and just take the young people. Next slide, please. All right, this picture right here is an aerial shot of reproduction Viking longships rowing up a river. And actually, Matt was the one who gave me this. Thank you for that picture, Matt. It's awesome. But once again, the Viking longships were not only powered by sail, they were rowed. And I'm going to talk more about that here in a little bit. That was their main propulsion, was the rowing. All right, next slide, please. All right, now the Norse colonized Iceland during the same time as they were colonizing Ireland. Iceland is a little island that sits in between the British Isles and Greenland. Since the Vikings usually did not bring their women on ocean voyages, there was a lack of Scandinavian females to settle Iceland. So the Viking solution for this was to take female slaves, thralls, and transport them to Iceland. They had their own word for a female thrall, and that was a frill. A frill was basically a bed slave. If the Vikings captured you and you were an attractive looking young woman, unfortunately for you, that was going to be your fate. You were getting ready to be married a Viking. Now, the result of this is shown in the DNA study of Iceland's population. They analyzed the genomes of 25 archaic Icelanders whose skeletal remains were found in burial sites across the island. So they dug up these old tombs and got these skeletons. Now, DNA samples taken from teeth revealed that these settlers had a roughly even split of Norse and Gaelic ancestry. And Gaelic is from the British Isles. When the researchers compared the ancient genomes to those of modern Icelanders, it confirmed that the settlers, who are mainly Norse men and Gaelic women, are genetically indistinguishable from present-day Irish, Scots, and Scandinavians, because it's all the same DNA. Next slide. All right, so what did the Vikings do in Ireland besides take slaves and loot monasteries? Glad you asked. All right, this ship here, pictured on the left, is called Skulev 2. It's an oak-built warship known as a longship, and specifically known as the Drakkar. That name for Cologne, Drakkar, that comes from the Viking longship. Is approximately 100 feet long and 12 feet wide, and would have a draft of just 3 feet with a crew of 70 to 80 men. It only took 3 feet of water to float this thing. So in the shallow end of your neighborhood pool, this 100-foot ship would float. That was how they go anywhere. Now, while the ship was excavated off the coast of Denmark, dendrochronology, which is the study of ship timbers, showed the ship was built in the Dublin area around 1042 and was also repaired with other timbers in the same area around the 1060s. So this ship was built and was in Ireland for decades. Now, 200 years prior, Dublin was invaded by Norsemen. The area formed a dark pool, or Dub Linn in Gaelic, which provided a safe harbor for the Viking longships. And that's how come they focus on it so much. Now, the shape of the ship and a large sail area of an estimated 370 square feet would have allowed for great speed. Nautical architects, which are the guys that figure out the speeds of ships and everything and how to build them, estimate its speed of up to 15 nautical miles an hour, which is 17 land miles per hour, with a rowing crew of 60 plus while under sail. Now, the way you figure out the maximum speed of a sailboat, of a modern boat, is you take 1.34 times the square root of the waterline length. So a 100-foot sailboat will do, the max speed it can do really is 13.4 nautical miles an hour, or 15 land miles an hour. So with its oarsmen, Skulev 2 would beat most modern sailboats. That's how fast these things were. Now, the Vikings didn't only raid on shore. They were all about being pirates on the ocean too. Back in the day, if you were a medieval merchant with a ship sailing across the ocean and you saw a Viking longship come up behind you, you didn't even try to run, because you knew if you did, you weren't going to beat them. And two, if you actually made the Vikings have to get out their oars and break a sweat to catch you, when they did catch you, which they would, not only were they going to take everything on your ship, It's going to be real bad for you. All right. Next slide, please. All right. Now, after being driven from Dublin in 902, the Vikings returned 14 years later and landed their large fleets both in Waterford Harbor and near Dublin. Now, this is a concentrated effort by two Vikings, Ragnall and Sihtric. Once again, if you watch a Viking show on TV, Ragnall, yep, he's a real Viking too. Now, Ragnall was a Norse ruler in England, seeking to expand his holdings, and Sihtric was his kinsman. And they both began raids deep into Ireland, almost certainly seeking inclusive battle with the Irish. Next slide. Now, the king of the O'Neills probably marched his forces into Munster to face Ragnall. However, no battle took place for them for more than a fortnight. A fortnight's about 2 weeks. Possibly the O'Neill king was waiting for support from the allied Leinster, but this is not to be. The king of Leinster marched his forces toward Dublin to face Sihtric. They fought a battle near Confrey at Kildare, and the battle was a decisive victory for the Norse, who killed hundreds of Irishmen, including the king of Leinster, and then proceeded to plunder the rest of Kildare. Now, afterwards, Sihtric was easily able to reassert Norse control of Dublin, and the Viking presence have returned on a more permanent basis. All right, next slide, please. Now, what followed the next decade was a period of rapid Norse expansion, as numerous small settlements grew into proper fortified towns. These included Waterford, Cork, Limerick, and Wexford. Pretty much every major Irish town near the coast became a Viking. Now, no more could Irish kings only focus their efforts on liberating Dublin. In 919, the O'Neill king decided to try once more, marching an army against Dublin directly, meeting Sihtric at the Battle of Island Bridge. It was another Irish disaster, a decisive victory for the Norsemen, and again, the Irish king was among the dead. Viking Dublin's position was now even more secure. Now, in 920, Sihtric left Dublin to take Ragnall's kingship in York, England, after his death, leaving the Irish king to his kinsman, Gothard. All right, next slide. Now, Gothard had a fearsome reputation, even amongst other Vikings. He was soon raiding, pillaging, and slaving like Ireland had never seen before. His thrust reached far into the north of Ireland, but there were crucial differences between his attacks and earlier ones. When he seized the important Christian settlement of Armagh, the home of the Church of St. Patrick, he did not destroy any churches or butcher the wounded. So it's not unreasonable to assume that this is evidence of the incipient Christianization of the Norse in Ireland. Because the Vikings have been in Ireland now for more than 100 years, and Ireland was a Christian land. So now some of the Vikings were starting to become Christians as well. Now, his movements northward also were more like military campaigns and raids. And it seems possible he's attempted to exert a permanent presence on the East Coast, expanding the Kingdom of Dublin. All right, next slide. If so, he's opposed by two forces. Murdoch MacNeil of the O'Neills was the king of Ailech, and he inflicted several losses on Gothard's forces in 926. In one of these, Gothard's son was killed, and the survivors surrounded to be saved only by a swift relief force led by Gothard himself. Now, Murdoch was a famous and military figure of the time, described as the Hector of the Irish. And he spent most of his life fighting the Norse and neighboring Irish kingdoms. However, as valiant as he was, he never tried to attack Norse Dublin directly. So, next slide. The second force opposing Viking Dublin, as was so often the case, fellow Vikings. Those who had founded and built up Limerick had become a considerable power base themselves. In the 920s and 30s, open warfare between themselves and the Norse Dublin was widespread. They were fighting each other all the time. Now, Gothard attacked Limerick directly in 924, but was beaten off with some loss. And 3 years later, he left Dublin to try and become king of York, England, following Sihtric's death, but was driven out by an Anglo-Saxon king. Now, the Anglo-Saxons came from Germany, Now, not the modern province of Saxony in Germany. The Viking Age Saxon Germany was on the Jutland Schleswig-Holstein Peninsula, which is exactly where Denmark is. Denmark has the northern part of the peninsula, and Saxony, the old Saxon Germany, was the southern part. So the Anglo-Saxons and the Vikings were cousins. So right next door to each other. So anyways, he wanted to go over there and take England from the Saxons, but in his absence, the Limerick Norse seized Dublin. However, Gothard regained control of it upon his return. So once again, this was the Limerick Vikings attacking Dublin Vikings. So completely internecine warfare. Next slide, please. Throughout all this, the Irish also continued to fight each other, and the Norse continued to raid Irish settlements. Now, Gothard rampaged through Kilkenny in 930, for example, and the lack of cohesive response by the native Irish against the Vikings, as there had been in previous decades, was a major reason for North expansion and stability. Accordingly, the Dublin and Limerick Norse were able to fight each other without fear of concerted attacks by the Irish. You didn't have to worry about it. Next slide, please. Now, the Civil War came to an end in 937 when Gothard's son Aimlib forced Limerick into submission. And Aimlib went to England soon after to engage in war against the Saxons, shortly after that. Now, Dublin was left in the hands of a Viking named Blackare Mac Gofred. All right, the reason I have Mac bold, Mac was not a Viking name. Mac or Mick is Gaelic for son of. So by this time, the Vikings were becoming so ensconced in Irish culture, they were using Gaelic names. Now, he stamped his own authority and made his presence known by killing the O'Neill king in 943 near Armagh. However, this success was short-lived, as Dublin was sacked the very next year by the new High King of Ireland. The High King of Ireland was attacked by a rival O'Neill claimant to the throne. Now, this internecine war allowed Blackare to retake Dublin, but in 948 he was slain in battle at Meath. Meath is in purple on the left picture there. Kingdom of Mid was Meath. Just meant Gaelic for middle part of Ireland. Next slide, please. Now, what followed over the next several decades was a tangled web of politics, marriage alliances, and varying coalitions with neighboring kingdoms. By now, the settled Vikings were fully involved in the wars of the native Irish. Aimlib and Domhnall were brothers-in-law, but this does not stop them from near constant warfare between the two, either directly or through attack by proxies. Now, both sides had the victories and losses, with Domhnall having great success in the Midlands, while Aimlib maintained Norse control of Dublin and influence throughout Leinster, pictured there on the right. These wars sucked in numerous smaller kingdoms and dominated Irish life at the time. You could not, if you were in Ireland, the Vikings were completely involved in your life, without doubt. Next slide, please. Now, Domhnall died in 980. His successor was a descendant of the man who achieved several significant victories over the Vikings a century previously. He was also Aimlib's stepson, but this did not matter as Mael had already attacked Dublin previously in 935. Now as High King, he moved to continue Domhnall's war on the Dublin Norse. His forces consisted primarily of men from his home kingdom of Mid, which I showed you earlier, backed up by troops from Leinster and Munster. Now his opponents called upon their own forces, as well as troops as far away as the Hebrides and the Isle of Man. That's the crest of the Isle of Man right there on the left. Now, due to his advanced age, the Norse were led by Aimlib's sons. Next slide, please. All right. Now, the forces clashed on a hill near Tyre Meath in 980. This resulted in Amlum's son Ragnall being killed, as well as several Irish kings, but a decisive victory for the Irish was achieved. Now, the Norse took very heavy losses, so Mael was able to assault Dublin and take it with ease. Now, Amlwyn was forced to abdicate, and he died in religious retirement in Iona. Okay, Iona was an island off the coast. Island was a Christian monastery. It was not Odinist. So the fact that Amlwyn retired there in religious retirement indicates that he was not an Odinist. He was a Christian, or he wouldn't have gone there. So once again, by this time in Irish history, the Vikings had become, in a lot of ways, more Irish than Viking. Now, he was replaced by his son, who was Mael's half-brother. Next slide. All right, Battle of Clontarf. Now, this took place on 23 April, which was Good Friday, 1014 at Clontarf near Dublin. It pitted an army led by Brian Boru, the High King of Ireland, against a Norse-Irish alliance. So once again, it was not just the Irish versus the Vikings. It was the Irish versus the Vikings and other Irish. Composing the force of the King of Dublin, the King of Leinster, and a Viking army from abroad led by Sigurd of Orkney and Broder of the Isle of Man, which I showed you previously. The Isle of Man is an island in between Scotland and Ireland, which was totally Viking at that time. Now, this battle lasted from sunrise to sunset and ended in a rout of the Viking and Irish Leinster armies. Next slide. It was also the definition of a bloodbath. It is estimated that between 7,000 and 10,000 men were killed in this battle, including most of the leaders on both sides. Although Brian's forces were victorious, Brian himself was killed, as were his son and his 15-year-old grandson. The Irish Leinster king and Viking leaders Sigurd and Bruder were also slain. Now, after this battle, the power of the Vikings and the kingdom of Dublin was largely broken. The battle was an important event in history and is recorded in both Irish and Norse chronicles. In Ireland, the battle came to be seen as an event that freed the Irish from foreign domination, and the late Brian was hailed as a national hero. But he was also the last High King of Ireland because, remember, he, his son, and his grandson were all dead. So that was pretty much the end of his lineage as High King. Next slide, please. This essentially was the end of the Viking Age in Ireland. Not because the Vikings actually left. The Vikings at that point had been in Ireland for more than 200 years. They had nowhere to go. Yeah, their families had come from Scandinavia, but their ancestors, but they've been there for 200 years. They weren't going anywhere. But so essentially, the Vikings were no longer Vikings per se. For generations, they had been mixing with the natives, producing a race called the Norse Gaels. They have their own term, their own ethnicity, the Norse Gaels. Now, Dublin always had a large Irish population with a Norse elite, and the integration of the Norse into Irish culture cannot be denied. Added to this was the Christianization of the Norse, the intermarriages with the royal families of Ireland, and the cessation of traditional Viking activity, raiding and slaving. So the Vikings had become more Irish than Norse by this point. So they didn't need to go anywhere. They didn't have any more power. That was now in the hand of the Irish, but the Vikings just stayed right there. Next slide. They just weren't in charge. All right, here's a quick 200-year timeline of the Vikings in Ireland. Once again, in 795, the Vikings first arrived in Ireland for small raids. And then in 832, 120 Viking ships arrived on Ireland's north coast. In 841, Dublin was created as a Viking settlement and became the most important Viking town in Ireland. In the 850s, the Vikings pushed south and then settled Cork, and Waterford and Armagh was sacked by the Vikings. Now in 869, the king of Connacht defeated the Vikings near Glenveagh. If you look on the right, or excuse me, the left side of the map of Ireland in red, that's Connacht. That Irish king was able to defeat the Vikings. So they were not able to get really ensconced there. Pretty much most of the rest of Ireland they were, but that stayed pretty much primarily Irish. In 1014, Brian Boru, king of Munster and the High King of Ireland, defeated the Vikings at the Battle of Clontarf. The Vikings were so ensconced in Ireland that historians have given them their own label, the Hiberno-Scandinavians. Once again, the Norse Gaels and the Hiberno-Scandinavians, same groups. Next slide, please. All right. So how extensive was Viking control of the British Isles? Purple on the map on the right was Viking control of the British Isles at its height. You can see that once again they had every major seaside town in Ireland. They had all the northwest coast of Scotland and a big chunk through the middle of England. This picture on the left is the church entrance for Stillingfleet Church in Yorkshire, which once again was a part of England the Vikings had. It's a solid wood door, is famous for its Viking ironwork and representations of a Viking ship and other signs meant to act as good luck charms. The exterior door is 4 inches thick, solid cedar, and is still being used today in the church. But once again, that just shows you how dominant the Vikings were in the British Isles at that time. Next slide. All right, and speaking of Scotland, we know that from the 700s to the 1200s, the Vikings also controlled northwest Scotland. So what happened there? By the 5th century AD, the Gaelic kingdom of Dalriada had emerged from Ulster, Northern Ireland, overtaking parts of western Scotland. As its kingdom grew in size and influence, the tribe became known as the Scotti, which was the Roman Latin for Gaels. And they were coming over there because once again, the Romans left Britain at that time. And that created a power vacuum. So the Scotti tribe came from Ireland into northwest Scotland. Now, at the same time they were growing in power, the Vikings were coming in too. Now, the Vikings and Gaels intermarried and created the Norse Gaels, which we already talked about. Now, eventually, the Scottish king tried to buy the land from the Norwegian king. He refused, and the Scots stirred up dissent. Haakon, the king of Norway, mounted a preemptive attack to secure Norse control of the territory. And in July 1263, he sailed with 200 longships of 60 plus warriors each. So this is more than 12,000 men. In the Hebrides, which are the islands off the coast of Scotland, he was joined by the King of Man, which we talked about earlier, with additional forces. And from there, they sailed down the coast of Scotland, raiding the mainland. Next slide. Now, in October, during stormy weather, several Norwegian vessels were driven aground near modern-day Largs. You look at the map, Largs is a circle in red on the coast. It's just about maybe 20, 30 miles east of Glasgow, or west, you mean. Now, while the Norwegians were salvaging their vessels, the main Scottish army arrived on the scene. Now, the Norse were formed in two groups. The main went on the beach, and a smaller contingent atop a nearby hill. Now, the advance of the Scots threatened to divide the two Viking forces, so the contingent on the mound ran to rejoin their comrades on the beach below. Seeing them running, the Norwegians on the beach thought they were beating a hasty retreat, and themselves drew back to their ships. Now, there was fierce fighting on the beach, and the Scots took a position on the mound formerly held by the Norwegians. Now, after several hours of skirmishing, the Norse recaptured it, the Scots withdrew, and the Norse reboarded their ships. Now, the weather deteriorated. Hakon's fleet sailed to the Orkney Islands to overwinter. Now, the Orkney Islands were to the north of Scotland. So they just went up there to, and they was completely controlled by the Vikings, and they went up there to hang out for the winter. With his fleet and forces intact, Hakon planned on continuing the campaign after spending the winter in Orkney, but he got sick and died there over that winter. Next slide. Now, within months of the failed campaign, emissaries were sent from Norway to discuss terms of peace. Meanwhile, the Scots seized the initiative and made ready to punish any clan lairds who had supported the Norse. By the end of the year, the Hebrideans and Manx were forced to submit to the Scots. And the Hebrides, once again, are circled in green, and the Isle of Man is circled in red. Now, the successor to Hakon, his son, did not want to keep up the fight. He said, "Hey, this is my dad's thing, trying to regain Scotland. I'm not interested in doing that." And in 1266, almost 3 years after the battle, terms of peace were finally agreed upon by the Norwegian and Scottish kings. Now, after Hakon's death, his successor, Magnus Hakarsson, son of Hakon, king of Norway, signed the Treaty of Perth, leasing Scotland's western seaboard to Scottish King Alexander III in return for a yearly payment. Now, the lease became permanent, but the Kingdom of Scotland eventually stopped paying the Norwegian crown when the Norwegians were involved in the Civil War. The Scots go, they're too busy fighting each other, we'll stop paying them. Now, the Treaty of Perth, by the way, the Orkney and Shetland Islands are circled in yellow to the north. Under the Treaty of Perth, they remain the possession of Norway. So once again, the Scots got the Hebrides on a permanent lease, but the Orkney and Shetlands remain Norse. And eventually what happened, an Earl of Orkney, who was a nobility on both the Norse and the Scottish side, decided to give them to Scotland. And the King of Norway was not happy. He goes, "You can't do that. Those belong to me. I'm the king, and I'm the only one that can give those to Scotland." And for years, he tried to get them back, but whenever he had sent an emissary to the Scottish king just ignored him, like, whatever. Next slide. All right, real quick segue. Going to talk about fairies, and you'll see why. Now, fairies is a mythical being of folklore and romance, usually having magic powers and dwelling on Earth in close relation to humans. Now, originally in the Celtic religion, there were multiple deities, just like the Vikings' Odinism had multiple gods. The original religion in Ireland had the same thing. But the situation changed when Christianity spread to Ireland. Those deities had been worshipped before the conversion to Christianity, were then reduced to the status of fairies in Celtic mythology. Now, in the Celtic tradition, the former deities were not fairies in the sense people assume. They look very much like humans in size and shape, except they had special powers, and they seemed eternally young, with some exceptions. Now, the fairy folk were seen as a race of usually fair, meaning attractive-looking people. They could die just as mortals can, but their lives could also last hundreds, even thousands of years. Next slide. All right. Now, the Irish fairies fall in two broad categories: trooping fairies, which are social fairies, and solitary fairies. Now, social or trooping fairies were those that lived in a large company, like a clan. The social fairies were ruled by a king or queen, or both. They were often seen feasting, singing, and dancing. Now, they could be either benevolent or hostile humans. Even though they look like a happy bunch of fairies, they could still have it out for humans. But they could also be nice. Now, the solitary fairy usually avoided large gatherings. There are many types of solitary fairies, such as the banshee, the leprechaun, the clericon, the brownie, and the puka. Generally, they get recognized by the type of jackets they wore. The social fairies wore green jackets, while the solitary fairies wore red, brown, or gray jackets. So on the right, we got the good old Lucky the Leprechaun from Lucky Charms cereal. I need one of you to volunteer to contact General Mills Corporation and let them know their leprechaun's wearing the wrong jacket. Should be a red jacket. Next slide. All right. Leprechauns became associated with gold after the Vikings' invasion of Ireland. Legend had it that the Vikings left the leprechauns in charge of their plundered wealth, which the little men put in crocks and pots, have hidden throughout Ireland, wherever the rainbow's in. So not only is Lucky the Leprechaun wearing the wrong colored jacket, he's nothing more than a Viking patsy. Sorry, Lucky. It's true. Next slide, please. All right. The Norseman pub is actually in Dublin. And if you guys have any questions about the lecture, please text him to Matt and he will ask.
That's right. Thank you so much for giving that presentation. That was a lot of information, and those were really interesting slides. So yeah, now's the time. If anybody's got any questions for John, you just go ahead and type them into chat. I will pass them on to him. I'll give you a few minutes to do that. In the meantime, I wanted to mention John's book, which he gave a presentation for us. Oh gosh, when the book came out, how long ago was the book published?
It was published in January.
January. Yeah, so we had you maybe in March or February.
Yeah, sounds about right.
Yeah, so pick up a copy from Amazon, or you know, if you're at the Lexington County Library, we've got a few copies of it as well. But I read it and it's fantastic. So yeah, I highly suggest it. They can do a search on Amazon, right, John?
You can get on Amazon or Barnes and Noble.
Barnes and Noble, right. So again, if you've got any questions, go ahead and type those into chat. I had a question that I wanted to ask John while you guys are in there typing. So how did you go about doing your research for your book, the Magnus Saga Beyond Vinland, and then also your research for your presentations for you know, the Highland Games and all that? Do you go to the library? Do you get online? You know, how do you go about doing your research for your stuff?
Well, I first got into the whole Viking thing back in college because I studied archaeology. You know, anthropology was a major, which the field of archaeology is under, and then with my minor in history. And one of the things I studied about in college was about the Viking settlement at Lance Miju up there, which is actually Bay of the Jellyfish in French, up there in Canada, Newfoundland, Canada. Back in the 1960s, Norwegian archaeologists, a husband and wife, excavated a Viking settlement there. And so that conclusively proved that the Vikings had come here to America. And there's been all the kind of things that have been found out since then that indicate that the Vikings were probably here in a lot greater numbers than just up there in Canada. So that kind of got me into it. And then also, as I talked about when I was in the Marine Corps, I went to Norway for that winter. It snowed so hard, it snowed sideways. I've never seen anything like that in my life. The only way you get around over there in the winter is on skis or snowshoes. We would go out on a ski march and it would be snowing so hard you couldn't see the man's pack in front of you. You had to hold on to it, you couldn't see it. He was literally 2 feet in front of you, couldn't see him. That's how hard it snowed. And I'm kind of thinking, I'm like, wow, I really do understand how come the Vikings want to be anywhere else but here in the wintertime. So I started doing the research, and I do go to libraries to do it there, but I also go online, and I give presentations, as you mentioned, at Highland Games, Celtic festivals, and now Viking festivals as well, over various historical topics. And doing the research for that, I started finding out more stuff to put in the book. And that was what led to the book getting written.
Cool. So we talked a little bit about a couple of the lasting influences of the Viking on maybe the Irish language or arts and culture. Are there any other examples, like, say in their carvings or in their writings, that we see Viking influence that's carried over even into today?
Well, Viking influence is all over the English language. Tuesday is Tyr's Day. Tyr was the Norse god of wisdom. Wednesday was Woden's Day or Odin's Day, the main Norse god. Thursday was Thor's Day, the Norse god of thunder, and the DC Comics. And then Friday was Freya's Day. She was the Norse goddess of marriage and childbirth. So we have, besides the word enthralled I talked about, there are so many Viking words that are still in the English language. Honeymoon. Honeymoon was a period when newlywed Norse would be left alone to get to know each other and drink mead, which is distilled from honey. Mead is Viking beer. They figured out you could take honey, put water in it, put it in the sun, and it turned to alcohol. And that's what a honeymoon was. They'd be left alone for a month, period of a moon, to drink honey mead and get to know each other. So the Vikings have so much influence to this day in everything in Western culture. They were just so prevalent everywhere.
Cool. And if you would, you want to give us a brief explanation or cover talk about what Magnus' saga is about.
Absolutely.
I don't think I'd do it justice, but if you got a couple minutes, you can. I'd love to spread the word about what that book's about.
Absolutely. Well, when I was doing the research for these Highland Games, Celtic festivals, and Viking festivals, I found out that there were so many things that point to extensive Viking interaction with Native North Americans. And so I'm like, wow. And some of the things in the book, Magnus sails to Vinland up there in Newfoundland, Canada. And then from there, he pushes down to the modern day state of New York and goes up the Niagara River. And it has to overcome Niagara Falls, which once again, the Viking longships were so light that if the Vikings could not get up a river because there was something in the river blocking it, they would actually drag them out on the shore and manhandle them past the obstruction. Because remember, they had crews of 60 or 70 guys, and the ships were built out of wood. So could 60 to 70 guys push a 20,000-pound boat? Yeah, they can. And they did all the time. Because people in Europe weren't stupid. If they lived on a river, they knew the Vikings were eventually going to come. So they'd sink like boats and stuff in the river to block it. And the Vikings would come upon that and just pull it out and keep going. You put it back in the water once it got past that. So that's what Magnus and his crew do on the Niagara River. They overcome Niagara Falls and then get into Lake Erie. And the whole way they're interacting with Native North American tribes, befriending some, but then getting drug into wars with the rival tribes. So,
and again, this is historical fiction, taking a little, probably a couple liberties, like we talked about before. But still, it's an interesting, it's an interesting work.
Well, thank you. And once again, there's been so many. All you have to do is just go on a search engine of Viking stuff in America, and all kinds of things will pop up that people are like, that's probably the Vikings. All kinds of things.
Right. Awesome. Well, let's see if we've got any more questions. Are they still finding evidence of Viking influence in Ireland and Scotland? Are they still, uncovering materials?
Well, they are. They're still digging up like various like Viking cemeteries or whatever, and they will, they at some point it gets a little tough to figure out if it's really Viking, because once again the Vikings were so prevalent there, they intermarried with the Scottish, the Irish, and the English. So there was no standalone Vikings and other people. They were all intermarried. So it's like, okay, well, how can you tell for sure what you've excavated was only Viking?
Viking versus
just
Irish or
people they intermarried with.
Yeah, right.
For the first, couple decades, sure, they can tell the difference, I'm sure. If you find something from 800 AD, you can say, okay, well, that's just when the Vikings were first getting there. So they're probably kind of standalone Vikings who were Irish or Scottish or whatever. But after that, they were just so intermingled. It's kind of like, well, I mean, they find stuff all the time. They're like, this is probably Viking,
Probably,
but
yeah.
we can't prove it because once again, they were so intertwined.
Right. All right. That's the last question that I had that actually came in. And so let's see, I've got 7:26 on my end. I'm going to take the last of it to the last couple minutes to thank John for being here. It's a pleasure. It's always a pleasure when we have you. I think this is the 4th year that we've had you. I think we did one of our favorite programs that had pretty good attendance too was we did a Halloween program, or
Yep.
I guess it was Irish traditions of Halloween or the origin stories.
Yeah.
Maybe we'll get you in here back in person. I don't know. You're in North Carolina now. It's harder for you to come see us, but maybe we'll do a virtual talk again about the history of Halloween and Irish and Scottish influence on that.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that was a good talk. That was really interesting. Yeah, so thanks for being here, John. Hopefully we'll have you again soon. Again, yeah, take a look at John's book. If you Google it, Magnus Saga Beyond Vinland, you'll find it at Amazon and Barnes & Noble. And without further ado, I want to sign off. If you got anything else to say, John?
Matt, thank you very much for having me. As I said before we kicked off, I'm going up to Ohio next week for the Ohio Viking Fest. And I'll be talking about the Vikings in Ireland. So this was a perfect opportunity to practice. This was
Cool.
This was huge.
Great. All right. And if anybody's on here on chat too, if you want to have John come out to your organization, I'm sure he'd be happy to do it. You can just shoot me an email. Yeah, I can get you in touch with him. But thanks, everybody. I appreciate everybody attending tonight. And I'm going to sign off. You want to say something, John?
Real quick, if anybody wants to go on my website to see what my upcoming presentations are going to be, you can, as well as the list of presentation topics I have. It is www.historicallectures, all one word.com.
Yep.
So historicallectures.com.
Yep. All right. Without further ado, thanks, John. I'm going to sign off.
Thank you, Matt.
Thanks. I appreciate it.